there is a task at hand. The text for this morning comes from the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 3. It reads on this: what do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? For the few lines that we have to share together for these few moments, I want to ask a question. What is the point? Have you ever played Monopoly? The board game. Matter of fact, I have. As a child, I remember playing this board game with my family. About midway through the game, I began to ask the question, what is the objective of the game? Essentially, what is the point? No one could give me a clear answer. Some said it's to get some properties. Another said it's to accumulate the right amount of money. Others said we just play on until we get tired. I wondered what was the point. And just as this question of what is the point, I ponder the same question in life. As I wonder the grand scheme of things, I ponder what is the point. Hopefully you can concur that you share the same sentiment, and I believe that one of the deepest, darkest, and divisive questions of our time is what is the point? What is the point of God doing what he does in our lives? What is the point of how God moves what he moves? What is the point of how God puts us where he puts us? I believe that this question is with me. It appears that every time we turn around, there is something going on. It appears that why am I killing myself and dedicating myself and suffering? So what is the point of why I do what I do? As we approach the parameters and the perimeters of our text, I believe that this question can be associated with our author. Theologians and scholars build these words to an old wise collect or to a preacher or to a teacher. This preacher poses these questions of what do people gain from all the toil in which they toil under the sun? Essentially, this old wise preacher, this teacher, is asking the question of what is the point? But I can't but help but see that this wise preacher posed the question just like me. I believe that this preacher, this wise teacher, was at a frustrated point in time in life. Matter of fact, I would conclude that this teacher, this preacher, this Kohelet was at a deep and dark place. As a matter of fact, they say in the verse 2 that vanities of vanities. All is vanity. As a matter of fact, this Kohelet, this teacher, this preacher wouldn't even tag his name to his writing. He's in a deep and he's in a dark place. And I believe that he uses this word vanity. I looked up that word and I found out that it could mean that your efforts are futile. Right? So he says that vanities of vanities, all is futile, all is vanity. That's where he finds himself in the text. He says, what would it profit a man that he worketh all day under the sun? I contend that this preacher thought his efforts were futile, and I believe that is where I stand. Why would God give me the gift of preaching if there's nowhere to preach? Why would God give me sermon after sermon if I never get to share? What's the point of putting me in relationship after relationship if I can never find the one? I've asked God, what is the point? Matter of fact, I'll be honest with you today. Why would God put me at a preaching festival, give me a message to preach, then tell me a day before I need to change? What is the point? Somebody has to feel me as I ask this question, what is the point? Sometimes I feel like I'm a hamster in a cage and God's the kid turning the wheel as I go around and around. I believe that the question that we ask is, what is the point? What is God's end game? What is God's objective in doing what he's doing? So this preacher, this teacher, this Kohelet asks, what is the point? What's the point of being full and young of vigor if the church doesn't want it? What's the point of being innovative if the church doesn't want your ideas? What is the point of crafting a good sermon only to be told that you were too long and too informational? What is the point of going to seminary only to be told you're too righteous? What is the point if all your efforts are futile? This old wise preacher asked the question within the perimeters and the parameters of our text. And I believe this preacher came to about 3 conclusions about what is the point about why God does what he does. The first reason that what is the point about why God does what he does is because he puts us through a perpetual process. is right there. God puts us through a perpetual process. This Kohelet, this preacher, this teacher poises the question of what do people gain with their toil under the sun. The preacher begins to describe something through these 9 verses, through verse 9 through verse 12, that he declares life is a process. Furthermore, he describes that life is a perpetual process. Comes and goes, and he says generations come and generations go. He says the sun ariseth, but the sun also setteth. He claims that the wind blows south, but then it blows north. This Kohelet, this preacher, contends that everything is a perpetual process. Everything is a perpetual circle. As we wonder why God does what he does and he moves the way he moves in our lives, no doubt it is frustrating, but when it appears that we always go around and around. But this teacher, this preacher, this Kohelet tells us that we are in a perpetual process. And young preachers, that ought to be good to know that in the midst of much inconsistency, God provides us with consistency. If we are financially broke, then we are consistently financially broke. If we are consistent, if we are single, then we are consistently single. If we are depressed, then we are consistently depressed. God puts us in a process. However, this process, this cycle, does something for us. It grows us. You've heard the slogan, no pain, no gain. I'm reminded of the response of a well-known athlete who would say, when he was asked by a reporter, what makes you so good? The athlete responded by saying, I put my body on a strict regimen. I keep my body in the best of shape. I put my body on the line so that when it's time to perform, my body works for me and I don't have to work my body. Can you see this athlete lifting weights, doing curls, doing squats, bench press, knee lifts, lunges? Can't you see that he or she puts his body in the perpetual process so when it's time to perform, their body can stand it? How can you get stronger if you don't lift some weight? How can you run faster if you don't train? This preacher, this teacher says that God puts us in a perpetual process. And I realize that it might be good to know that we're all a part of the process. How much better, how much easier if we understood that we were all a part of the process. Not only does this preacher, this teacher conclude that the point of why God does what he does is to put us in a perpetual process, but he also points out that it's to put us in a proper place. In this chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, this Kohelet, this teacher, this preacher begins to say that there is a specific time and a specific place for everything. He says there's a time to be born, a time to die, a time to pluck out, and a time to kill, a time to heal, a time to build up, and a time to break down, a time to get, a time to receive, a time to rend, a time to sow, a time for war, a time for peace. Yes, this preacher concludes that everything has its proper place. And the many frustrations that we have with our God, my friends, as we consider these things, our questions with God is why he does what he does. One must wonder, maybe he's just putting us in our proper place. We wonder why we haven't had the opportunity to preach. Maybe, unfortunately, it's just not our time. We wonder why we keep jumping in and out of relationships. Maybe we need to focus our attention on something else. This preacher, this teacher instructs us that everything has its proper place. But he goes back to asking this question: what do people gain from their toiling, in which they toil under the sun? Essentially, this old preacher asks once again, just like me, what's the point? But there's one more thing, there's one more conclusion I believe this Kohelet, this teacher, this preacher arrived to. Not only does God pose the question of, not only does God put us in a perpetual process, not only does God put us in our proper place, but God gives us a powerful perspective. It's right here, this preacher, this teacher, this Kohelet says everything has a proper place, but then he changes his tone of writing. He changes his outlook. He tells us that for everything there is a proper place, but then he moves us in telling us that God has made everything beautiful. Wait a minute. Was this not the preacher, the same teacher, who at the second verse said all is vanity? Was not this the preacher who was so ashamed that he didn't even not tag his name to this writing? But then he goes to say that everything that is beautiful, God made it. I did some research, and this is actually only the first time he speaks of God in the book of Ecclesiastes in the positive nature. Why was not this preacher He talks about that this powerful perspective is given in a threefold manner. First, he says God made everything beautiful in his time. Then he says that God knows what he's doing. Lastly, he says that it is God's gift that we delight ourselves in our toil. Don't you see this preacher's revelation? I don't know about you young preachers, but this gets me excited to know that while God knows what he's doing, and nobody knows what God is doing, but at the end of it, he wants us to delight ourselves in our toil. He wants us to pleasure ourselves in our journey. As I attempt to take my seat, there's a story. The story is told about a man who had a rock or a boulder in his yard. The rock or the boulder was an eyesore, and the man sought to remove it. So one day, as the man was sleeping, God came to him and said, I want you to push the rock. So the man, the next day, got up in the morning, and he began to push the rock. Weeks began to go by, and he kept on pushing the rock. Days began to go by, and he kept on pushing the rock. Months turned into years, and he kept on pushing the rock. His neighbors began to notice and said, why are you pushing the rock? It appears that the rock is going nowhere. He says, well, I'm pushing the rock because God told me to push the rock. The neighbor said, you might need to think about that. And you might need to say that you might need to stop pushing that rock. So the man decided, I'm going to stop pushing the rock. The very same night that he decided he was going to stop pushing the rock, God came to him again in his sleep and said, why did you stop pushing the rock? He said, well, I came to the conclusion that I couldn't move the rock. It was too heavy. It was too big. It was too gargantuan for me to do. God said, well, you got my instructions twisted. I told you to push the rock, not move the rock. And my brothers, my sisters, that ought to make us happy to know that I'm convinced that we need to understand that God asked us to push the rock, not move the rock. God asked us to push the rock while putting us in a perpetual process. As we push the rock, he puts us in our proper places. As we push the rock, he gives us a powerful perspective. And if you can't get what God is doing, I can pull up some biblical characters who said that all God asked them to do was push the rock. Come here, Abraham, God told me I was going to be the father of many nations. I didn't get to see the 12 tribes of Israel, but God told me to push the rock, and for all my life, that's what I did. Come here, Moses, for all my life, God told me I was going to be the deliverer. I was going to get them to a land flowing with milk and honey. I didn't get them to the promised land, but all I did was push the rock. Come here, Jesus, all I did was heal the sick. All I did was raise the dead. All I did was say, I pushed the rock, but then God came to me, and I even questioned my own self, saying, not my will, but my will get done. And y'all know the rest of the story. On a hill called Calvary, which is interpreted Golgotha, which is known as place as the skull, Jesus moved the rock. And that's how we ought to walk in our lives as young preachers. God called us to push the rock, but it's his responsibility to move the rock. As we wonder, what is the point? We understand that God has called us to push the rock and not move the rock. So we push on throughout disparities. We push on when people talk about us. We push on through difficulties. We push on when things are wrong. We push on when times are bad. We push on when nobody says amen. We push on when things are low. We push on when we are depressed. We push on when things are bad. We push on, but it's God's responsibility to move the rock. And as young preachers, our responsibility is not to push the rock, but it's our responsibility is to push the rock. And God moves the rock. So what is the point of our lives as young preachers? God called us to push the rock and not move the rock. Amen.